Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Amélie Canal-Vallée, and I am the director of Candy3. I'm really delighted to have you all join us today for this last Lunch and Learn of Candy3 for this session this year even. And so today we're going to be talking about timely challenges, heat, environmental adaptation, and racial disparities. And so without further ado, please let's move to the next slide. We want to acknowledge the many partners that make Candy3 possible, notably McGill, the University of McGill, which hosts this partnership, and our 39 partners that have made this training grant possible. And of course, with the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Next slide. And in terms of acknowledgement, we also want to recognize que l'Université McGill est sur un emplacement qui a longtemps servi de lieu de rencontre et d'échange entre les divers peuples autochtones, y compris les nations Haudenosaunee et Anishinaabe. Et nous remercions ces peuples et d'avoir été les stewards that they were the stewards of these lands and that we now are able to gather on these lands both physically and virtually and bring diverse peoples and different peoples of the world together through this partnership that is Candy3. Next slide. So this Lunch and Learn, for those of you who are used to it, les habitués, we ask you to hold your questions till the end. We will have the speaker speak for about 40 minutes and then move into a Q&A. So please, if you want, that said, if you have a burning question throughout the talk, please write it down. Ideally, tell us who you are, so your affiliation. And then our moderator, Miles Taylor, will call on you throughout the Q&A, or just hold it off and ask it verbally at the end during the Q&A. And speaking of our moderator, I will now turn it over to Miles Taylor, who is the chair of the substantive committee, who brings you this great lineup of Lunch and Learns. And so Miles will be introducing our speaker. Thank you, Miles.
Thanks. And again, I'm so excited to be introducing our last speaker for the Lunch and Learn series for this year. Dr. Ethan Raker is a social demographer specializing in disasters. He currently works as an assistant professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia. His research uses quantitative methods to examine how extreme weather events affect population health and demographic processes, drawing particular attention to racial and socioeconomic disparities. Some of his recent work appears in the journals of Demography, Social Forces, on Population Research and Policy Review. He holds a PhD in sociology from Harvard University. Dr. Raker, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you all very much for being here. I appreciate the invitation to join you all virtually. I'm talking to you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam people here in Vancouver, BC, and I'm super grateful to live and work on these lands. So today I'm going to be presenting this work in progress that I've been working on for I don't even want to admit how long this paper has been in progress, maybe 4 years or so. The title is Heat, Environmental Adaptation, and Racial Disparities in Cardiovascular Disease Mortality. And I'm taking you to a historical context, 1968 to 1979, which I hope to convince you is kind of strategic for important data-related reasons. So the motivation behind this study is the simple fact that extremely hot temperatures and heat waves are one of the deadliest weather-related hazards in both the United States and here in Canada. So in the US, heat is directly attributable to around 180 deaths per year. Where I'm based here in BC, the 2021 heat dome led to over 600 deaths and around 1,000 hospitalizations during a period of just 6 days of excessively hot temperatures in June 2021. Note that these statistics, however, understate the full burden of heat mortality because extremely hot temperatures also cause deaths by worsening underlying health conditions like cardiovascular disease or respiratory issues. And these are pretty difficult to attribute to heat by coroner's offices. So second, the heat effects on mortality are not equal across the population, such that people of color, including Black and Indigenous people, are disproportionately impacted, which mirror wider racialized environmental health disparities that have been documented across a variety of extreme weather-related hazards. At the same time, we all know that climate change is intensifying the severity and spatial patterning of extreme heat, and it's altering multiple forms of environmental hazards that change the risk profiles of communities. And this leads to a growing interest by scholars and policymakers around interventions or environmental adaptations in understanding their implications for population well-being as well as health equity. But despite this growing kind of conceptual interest in understanding environmental adaptations, or even more academically, like theorizing processes of adaptations to climate change, data limitations have meant that few researchers have actually directly observed adaptations at scale or across social groups like racially diverse populations. And few scholars have been able to test the role of adaptations in mitigating mortality or health outcomes after extreme weather or environmental exposures. So this limitation means that there's kind of an outstanding empirical question that motivates my study, which is what happens to racial health disparities as environmental adaptations occur? Answering this empirical question is important to social demographers like myself for estimating environmental determinants of mortality, but it also has important theoretical implications for medical sociologists testing theories of fundamental causes of health inequity, and for environmental sociologists conceptualizing what adaptations are and how they work. This study is further motivated, therefore, on these theoretical grounds, Specifically, medical sociologists have long theorized a set of social conditions like socioeconomic status, racism, and stigma as fundamental causes of health to explain why health disparities or mortality differences persist despite changing intervening mechanisms linking social conditions to well-being. So this perspective holds that as technological advancements develop, like new drugs, new technologies, as well as new risks to health emerge, the use of flexible resources like money and knowledge allow those with these resources to avoid risks, no matter what risks are kind of relevant at a given time. In terms of race and racism, the theory posits that because racism systematically structures access to health protective resources, and because racism has direct effects on health, even as any specific health threat change over time, racial disparities will reproduce over time and across space. What do we already know about extreme heat and mortality in this context? Research has documented and quantified the magnitude of extreme heat on both all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality. So, for example, environmental economist Alan Barreca and colleagues have estimated that daily heat increases all-cause mortality rates by 0.5 or 0.5% per month, which declined in magnitude over the 20th century. More recently, scholars have documented racial differences in heat on cardiovascular disease mortality. They found in the US from 2008 to 2017, so relatively recently, that heat increased cardiovascular disease mortality by around 0.12%. And Black mortality by 0.19%, so already documenting some of these racial disparities. Most proximately, exposure to extremely hot temperatures increases the risk of a cardiovascular event through various biological mechanisms. So heat triggers thermoregulatory mechanisms like sweating to dissipate heat. The exhaustion of these processes or overwhelming of these processes lead to dehydration, hypotension, increased cardiac output that increases the risk of a cardiovascular event. Dehydration furthermore activates branches of like the nervous system that increases blood viscosity, raising the risk of myocardial infarction, heart failure, and stroke. So these biological processes are the most proximate ones to mortality, and they can be further exacerbated by a host of pre-existing health conditions like hormone regulation and body fat percentage. So despite a growing number of studies on heat and cardiovascular disease mortality, existing evidence is limited in important ways. First, prior studies tend to aggregate measures of heat exposure across large areas, like estimating state or provincial level average temperature, or they examine mortality changes over a long time horizon, like the effects across a year of mortality. These analytic approaches risk considerable measurement error, particularly for temperature aggregation, which may bias the estimates towards zero and understate the true effect of heat on mortality. And like I said before, further, few of these studies directly measure adaptation, even though they're often talked about in discussion sections or incorporate measuring adaptation in empirical analyses. Among the few exceptions, I should note most studies focus on urban areas, and none, to the best of my knowledge, disaggregate adaptation by social groups, and in particular by race, to test for racial disparities. So I'm going to address or attempt to address these prior limitations by focusing on a strategic historical context, 12 years from 1968 to 1979 in the United States. This context is strategic for data-related reasons. Most specifically, the 1970 and 1980 long-form censuses in the United States were the only ones to ask householders about access to residential air conditioning in their homes. And these data are furthermore available to be disaggregated by the race of the householder. During this time, there was also substantial and widespread adoption of residential air conditioning as electrification in the nation was completed in the late 1950s, and the technology developed such that it, over this period, increasingly became more affordable. And so, as such, this context provides unique leverage for testing some of these important propositions of theories. We can directly examine whether the uptake of this newer technology that can be used to mitigate heat effects on health, while at the same time observing how these risks changed over time. So within this context, I asked two research questions. The second one has a subpart. The first is simply, how did extreme heat affect cardiovascular disease mortality, and how did these effects vary across racial groups? Second is, how did access to residential air conditioning moderate heat effects and racial differences in effects? And as a subpart of question two, I then further ask how the moderating role of AC on the heat mortality relationship further varied across social, economic, or infrastructural contexts. So here, I'm not concerned solely with greater or lesser levels of access to AC, but also how AC effects vary based on electricity prices, housing conditions, and broader forms of disadvantage like poverty. So to answer these questions in my empirical analysis, I construct a county month data set by combining a series of large-scale data from a variety of sources. So principally, I use information on population-level mortality from the National Center for Health Statistics down in the States. Mortality data include every death recorded in the US from January 1st, 1968 to December 31st, 1979. I restrict my analysis to deaths due to cardiovascular disease, which is 10.8 million deaths during this time. From each cardiovascular disease death record, I observe the county of death, the month and year of death, the sex, race, and age. And here, just in parentheses, I'll note I focus just on Black and white deaths. At this time, Black and white people in the United States made up approximately 96% of the population. This time period is before the Hart-Celler Act of 1968 really expanded the racial demographics of the United States. And so I'm just going to focus on white and Black folks in this talk. Daily temperature data come from a group at Oregon State University who provide estimates of temperature on 2.5 or by 2.5 mile grid of the continental US. So that's around 87 million grid day observations. So I estimate for each county day the minimum temperature by averaging all of the reads in those grid cells for which the centroid is in each of those counties. So for the average county, these data come from approximately 152 grids. I use the daily temperature reads from each county to construct monthly bend variables in 10, 5, degree centigrade bins, which captured the number of days in each month where the minimum temperature was anywhere between below -15 Celsius all the way up to my measure of extreme heat, which is greater than 25 degrees Celsius. Note here that I'm using daily minimum temperature. So these are days where the minimum did not fall below 25 degrees. On average, these days have a maximum temperature of 41 degrees Celsius and an average temperature across the day of 34 degrees. So this is a pretty good measure of extreme heat. I can talk about why I picked minimum temperature during the Q&A if you're curious. Third, I used the county level files from the 1970 and 1980 decennial censuses and estimate with annual interpolation the proportion of householders in each county year from 1968 to 1979 that had either central or room unit AC overall, as well as by the race of householders. So for white households and Black households separately. To model cardiovascular disease mortality, I use a series of measures. I first construct one that's widely used and is perhaps common to some folks in the room, which is age-standardized mortality rates. This standardizes mortality rates by accounting for differences in the population age distributions. It's simply calculated by summing the age-specific mortality rates here in the first equation denoted by D sub x over n sub x, and then weighting them using a standard population distribution, which allows for comparability across context and across time. So while the age-standardized mortality rates, or ASMR, is common in heat studies of mortality, I extend this by using a measure of premature mortality, which is the years of life lost. That's shown in the second equation. This measure of premature mortality incorporates information on both the number of deaths that occurred in a county month, as well as the expected remaining years of life lost for each individual at the time of death, which I gather from period life tables from the Centers for Disease Control. The years of life loss, YLL, for a given county monthly observation is computed by multiplying the age and sex-specific mortality rates by the residual life expectancy at the time of death, denoted here by E superscript 0, and then weighting by the standard population distribution. So again, this is a measure of premature mortality because it gives more weight to deaths that occur earlier in life. I then calculate each of these measures by race. So this is just showing you, for example, for the Black population, I estimate each of these equations for the Black cardiovascular disease age-standardized mortality rates and Black cardiovascular disease mortality years of life lost. Estimating the effects of temperature on mortality is difficult methodologically. Temperature has strong temporal and spatial clustering, so it's not randomly distributed across context and across time. Mortality is also influenced by a range of confounding factors like socioeconomic conditions, healthcare access, that also may correlate with temperature patterns. So to address these challenges, my approach leverages a series of high-dimensional fixed effects to account for unobserved time invariant and seasonal factors, and using daily temperature bins to capture nonlinear relationships with relatively greater precision. So I'm going to estimate the effect of extreme heat on mortality using this equation here. It exploits what we call plausibly exogenous variation in distribution of temperatures across county monthly observations. So Y here, the outcome is the monthly mortality rate for any individual county C, year Y at month M. So for example, Cook County in June 1975. The independent variable T represents the daily minimum temperature in those bins I referenced before. It excludes the reference category of the days between where the minimum was between 10 and 15 Celsius. It controls for county month fixed effects in pi. That nets out average differences in county-specific months, so like June in Cook County. It includes month-year fixed effects there in theta, which captures temporal differences that are constant across counties, so like all counties in the US, June 1973. and that like includes seasonal fluctuations, as well as state-specific time trends there in gamma, which capture secular trends in mortality constant across states. I also include a set of covariates there in X at the county year level that may influence mortality, like the age distribution, racial composition, healthcare access in terms of hospital beds per capita, housing characteristics operationalized using the median housing value and the share of housing units built before 1940, as well as my measure of AC prevalence. Identification here of extreme heat comes from what we call like idiosyncratic or random deviations in the distributions of daily temperatures within county month from long-run seasonal temperatures. So the assumption for this causal claim is that fluctuations in daily temperatures are orthogonal or unrelated to unobserved determinants of mortality, conditional on these sets of fixed effects and controls. From this equation, I recover what we call semi-elasticities. They're more easily interpretable. So in the exponential form, the semi-elasticity is derived by exponentiating those coefficients in delta K. This provides a more direct interpretation for the effect size. It tells us how much cardiovascular disease mortality increases or decreases per day of extreme heat relative to days when the temperature was between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius. Note for the race-specific models on Black and white mortality, I use the same modeling strategy, but race-specific mortality outcomes use race-specific control variables. I then extend this core empirical model I'm showing you here with a series of moderation models to assess the interaction between exposure to extreme heat and local levels of air conditioning for mortality. This is an extension by interacting local rates of AC overall or race specific, depending on the outcome, with each of those 9 temperature bands. The coefficients of interest there denoted by lambda test whether the effects of temperature on CVD mortality varied across local access to AC, with a hypothesis predicting that a negative coefficient such that heat effects on mortality are attenuated in places where there's more access to air conditioning in households. Finally, and this is, you can not look at that equation, I extend to a final set of models that add a third moderating variable to test whether the interaction between heat and AC was further heterogeneous across social and institutional contexts. So the three-way interaction coefficients, denoted by phi, test whether the moderating effect of AC on mortality were exacerbated or attenuated across contexts as a function of electricity prices, with the hypothesis being that in contexts where it's extremely expensive to run your AC, some folks may not during extreme heat events, putting them at a greater mortality risk. I also include as a third moderator housing conditions. Places with a large share of the housing stock that are older may have poor insulation. That means that AC is not as effective, as well as local estimates of poverty, such that people with fewer economic resources may not be able to run their air conditioning. So the three-way interaction term there tests whether this moderating role, and again, I hypothesize this as attenuating role, varied across local contexts. So getting to some of the descriptive statistics for this sample, or for this data set, pardon me. Given the distribution of the population across counties, the final analytic sample includes 1,808 counties in the US observed across 144 months, so 12 months across 12 years, which leads to a full sample of to around 260,000 county monthly observations. On average, the cardiovascular disease mortality ASMR was 37 deaths per 100,000 standard population. For whites, that was around 36, and for blacks, that was 47 deaths per 100,000 standard population. The average number of years of life lost to premature mortality to cardiovascular disease was 455 for white folks and 725 for black folks. In terms of extreme heat, 24% of counties experienced at least one day of extreme heat, and the average county month, this is not a particularly useful measure, experienced 0.03 days of extreme heat. So this is relatively rare. Other descriptive statistics there are shown. This chloropleth map shows the distribution of extreme heat during this time. Counties in gray are excluded due to their population. They're not included in the sample. All counties in Virginia, Alaska, and Hawaii are excluded because of data limitations. Those in pale yellow never experience a day of extreme heat during these 12 years. Those outlined in red, 435 counties experience at least one day, and the shading indicates the number of extreme heat days. So this is where the variation is coming from in the models to estimate the effects. And this occurs where we expect the concentration of heat in the United States to occur. These two panels map the changes in households with air conditioning in the United States from 1970 to 1980. Darker colors indicate more air conditioning. So first, we observe substantial variation across contexts in AC at both periods and a significant increase over time. In 1970, fewer than 1 in 3 households had any form of air conditioning. That increased to almost 60% by 1980 in the United States. However, this average across all households masks substantial differences across Black and white households. This scatter plot of county-level racial inequality in AC is showing you each dot is a county year observation. The x-axis there is the share of white households with air conditioning, and the y-axis is the share of Black households with air conditioning. So that red line across the entire plot would indicate parity in air conditioning. Any dot above that line indicates that a greater share of Black households had AC in the county year than the share of white households. Those below the line suggest that a greater share of white households had AC relative to their Black neighbors. In only 9% of county year observations did Black householders have greater AC coverage than white households in the same county. This is a stark inequality in this adaptive measure that averaging over all households really masks. The purple dot in the bottom left approximates the average for 1970, and the one that's a little bit in the upper right is for 1980. So in 1970, 39% of white households had AC compared to 18% of Black households. In 1980, closer to 60% of white households had AC compared to around 42% of Black households. So a persistent inequality in access to this potentially health beneficial resource. So now I'm going to return with 15 minutes left, great, to the quasi-experimental regression models to estimate the effect of heat on cardiovascular disease mortality. Here I'm displaying results from that core empirical model. These are 9 coefficients for each of the temperature bins with the excluded reference category as the 10th, days between 10 and 15 minimum temperature. I find that compared to a day where the minimum was between 10 and 15, a day of extreme heat increased cardiovascular disease mortality by 0.5%. Like other findings, the temperature CVD mortality relationship displays what we call like a reverse J distribution. Linear declines for cold temperatures and then what looks like an exponential increase for extreme heat temperatures. First, a few notes on these findings. First, note that extreme cold temperatures also increase cardiovascular disease mortality of a similar or greater magnitude to heat during this time. Second, using a back of the envelope calculation that uses the distribution of both heat and the population over this time, this 0.5% estimate, which hard to actually know what that means, translates to around 2,200 cardiovascular disease deaths that otherwise would not have occurred when they did due to extreme heat. However, these patterns are different starkly across race. This figure displays the estimates for white and Black cardiovascular disease mortality separately. I find that days of extreme heat increase Black cardiovascular disease mortality by around 1.3% per day, and that extreme heat increased white monthly mortality CVD rates by around 1/3%. So this is a difference of around a third, or 3 times the effect on Black mortality compared to white. And this is a significant and meaningful gap, suggesting that the magnitude, again, for Black mortality is triple compared to white cardiovascular disease mortality. Here I'm showing you the effects for years of life lost. And again, I document significant increase in premature mortality for the effect of extreme heat for Black populations, and only a marginally significant effect for white populations, which suggests that the concentration of heat effects on mortality among Black populations is skewed towards younger folks relative to those for white populations. I now turn to those models, the moderation models, which assess how local rates of AC moderate the heat effects on cardiovascular disease mortality. I find that for overall mortality rates and white mortality rates, increases in local air conditioning significantly reduced heat effects on mortality. Here, again, I'm displaying those semi-elasticities, just a little bit more interpretable, for the extreme temperature bends and the interaction between air conditioning, which is coded continuously between 0 and 100%. So that main effect of T is greater than 25C in the first row is the monthly predicted change in mortality per day of extreme heat when no household in a county has air conditioning. The interaction term is interpreted as the change in the heat effect on mortality per each increase in air conditioning. I find overall that each percent increase in AC is associated with a 0.02% reduction in heat effect on CVD mortality, and for whites, a 0.3% reduction. For Black mortality, I do not detect a significant moderating effect of AC on the heat mortality relationship. This figure visualizes this interaction, the estimated effects of extreme temperatures on monthly CVD mortality rates across AC levels from 10% to 90%. Estimates for white folks here in blue, pardon, in the last slides, I had reversed the colors, and for Blacks are in green. The panel on the left shows the moderating effect of AC on extreme cold. This is a type of placebo check because we don't expect that air conditioning to be particularly relevant for moderating the effect of extreme cold. And any detected significant moderation might suggest that there's something unobserved or some correlate of AC that is driving these moderation effects. But instead, across the AC distribution in local counties, there's no moderating effect of AC on extreme cold. That looks very differently for the panel on the right, which is the effect of extreme heat. And what we see here and reflected in the table I showed you before is that there's a greater negative effect for a negative slope for white mortality compared to Black mortality. The rug marks there on the x-axis just show you the distribution. It might be a little bit difficult to see the colors. The distribution of air conditioning across households based on race, showing in the green there that there's a concentration of observations for Black folks, for example, in the 10 to 40% range, and a concentration for white folks there in more the 50 to 80% range. Finally, I'm going to ask whether the mortality buffering association of air conditioning depends on broader social and economic contexts. This figure shows some of the results for the three-way interactions. It shows you the estimated difference in heat effects on mortality at high versus low AC coverage there on the x-axis, separately for Black on the left and white CVD mortality. And I estimate this differently across counties with low, average, and high shares of older housing stock, so housing that was built before 1940. Negative values on these bars mean that higher AC coverage is associated with a larger reduction in the estimated heat effect on mortality. The key pattern here is that the buffering association of AC is stronger in places with more older housing. So, in other words, AC from this model appears to be most protective in contexts where the built environment may otherwise make households vulnerable to heat. This pattern is visible for both Black and white mortality. So I interpret this evidence to suggest air conditioning access is not the sole thing that matters. It does not operate, therefore, like in isolation. Its association with reduced heat-related mortality depends on the housing context in which people live. Here I'm showing you whether the moderating association of AC varies by local electricity prices. Again, the outcome is the difference in the estimated heat effect on mortality between high AC and low AC counties. So negative values indicate that higher AC coverage is associated with smaller heat-related mortality. For Black mortality, the buffering association of AC is strongest where electricity prices are low, what I had hypothesized, and becomes weaker as AC prices rise. This suggests that access to AC may not translate into equal protection when the cost of using cooling is higher. For white mortality, differently, the estimates are also negative, but across all electricity price contexts. The pattern is flat, therefore, which suggests that the moderating role of AC on heat effects for mortality are not sensitive to electricity prices in the same way that they are for Black mortality. Finally, I'm showing you the same series for the share of low-income folks by race. Again, for Black CVD mortality, the moderating role of air conditioning is greatest in places where there's high levels of poverty, which suggests that in contexts where otherwise there's social vulnerability, having AC is particularly consequential. So these suggest not necessarily a story of who's deciding to run their air conditioning, with the hypothesis being that folks who are low income may not be able to run their air conditioning, but rather that there are broader forms of poverty and exclusion and marginalization that render them particularly vulnerable. And so having heat or having air conditioning is particularly effective. Again, across low income, there's no difference in the moderating role of AC for white households. So to conclude, these empirical findings show that extreme heat increased cardiovascular disease mortality significantly during this time. The estimates from back of the envelope calculation suggest that extreme heat led to around 2,200 deaths to cardiovascular disease during this time that otherwise would not have occurred when they did. Effects on Black cardiovascular disease mortality are nearly / almost exactly triple in magnitude compared to white mortality, in particular for premature mortality. Heat effects are greatest in places with low air conditioning, and AC adoption did little to offset racial differences or to narrow that gap during this time due to two complementary processes. One related to the distribution and access, such that Black households had less access in general, as well as the potential use or returns to that access based on those three-way interaction models, which suggests that the context in which AC exists or is accessible also matters as a function of the housing stock, electricity prices, and poverty. As with any research that I have ever done and ever will do, there are many limitations to consider. The first is that I examined a household level adaptive measure using county level data although these models are weighted by the county population. And I do not theorize residential AC to be something that is like a community benefit. It's certainly something that is beneficial to the householder or the members of the household. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, mortality records do not have an indicator of whether or not AC was uh, in the home of the person who passed. And so this is kind of the best that we have. And so we need to consider the potential ecological differences that occur within a population. Second, and while temperature can be identified from what I've argued as plausibly exogenous distributions in the number of days above 25C for the minimum, there's no exogeneity in terms of adoption of AC. So there's those models, therefore, I interpret to be testing for whether the plausibly causal effects of heat vary across these contexts. It's not a two-way causal framing. So what I argue theoretically in the paper is that this article provides new empirical support for a fundamental causal theoretical perspective on the persistence of racial disparities. So that is, during a context in which there was widespread adoption of air conditioning, unequal access to this newer health protective technology, and in particular, the uptake among white households led to a persistence in heat-related mortality and disparities across groups. So unequal access to AC and unequal benefits associated with AC meant that this technological adaptation did not eliminate racial disparities and heat-related mortality. More broadly, for those of us considering adaptation technologies, particularly here in BC after the heat dome, there were provincial efforts to increase access to residential air conditioning. These results suggest that adaptation might be most protective when it addresses broader social and infrastructural risks as well, such as the housing stock, poverty more broadly, and the electricity prices which matter for running air conditioning. So I will conclude there at 38 minutes. So thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments about the paper. I hope it wasn't too equation heavy, but I'm happy to explain anything further if it wasn't clear. And thank you so much to the kind invitation to join you.
Thank you so much. So now I'll be opening up to questions from our audience. As a reminder, it's fine to put questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand and I or one of our team members will call on you. Okay, I see Ganan.
Hey, Ganan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gina Hamad from University of Alberta, at Sociology Department, PhD student at Sociology. Thank you very much, Dr. Ethan, for this very nice presentation. And I have two questions. The first is, as white people are using more air conditioning, do you think that the use of traditional air conditioning, cooling systems that are unsustainable could increase the problem of heat? The second question is, do you think that regenerative design or sustainable design of cooling systems, such as those implemented in Vancouver housing, for example, earth tubes and air source heat pumps, do you think using these regenerative design strategies or systems that usually decrease the heat, the greenhouse gases emissions could reduce on the long term could reduce the problem of heat. So what I'm thinking of is to address the problem from the roots, like not just provide them with money to buy air condition and so on. Because if these air conditioning or cooling systems are sustainable ones, we are adding to the roots of the causes of the problem of the heat. But from my perspective, if we focus more on spreading like the regenerative design of buildings and the cooling systems, especially like what Vancouver Housing did, it like from my expectation, it may like contribute to the reduction of greenhouse emissions and consequently to the reduction of this problem that we are discussing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Ganon, those are excellent, excellent questions. I'll take the first one first. Yes. So in the empirical analysis, I am averaging exposure and treating exposure across racial groups as homogeneous within a county. We know that in urban places, that is not true. And particularly that is probably understating exposure to extreme heat among racialized populations because of urban heat islands, which running air conditioning can contribute to. So in urban places with concentrated housing, lots of folks running AC, particularly in places where there's lots of concrete, not a lot of shade from like parks, that exacerbates heat effects. It's certainly an empirical challenge. Unfortunately, within county estimates of population distributions, in an ideal world, we would know the distribution within a county of individuals, and then we would be able to know where, the differences across racial groups and exposure to heat, and we would look at heterogeneity within places. The US wasn't the within county estimates of population distributions weren't completed until 1990. So like in 1970, for example, very few places can you get within county distributions across racial groups and exposure. So it's a super important part of and limitation that I should definitely double check in the paper to ensure that there's a robust discussion of that. And that is likely estimating and biasing the effects of heat for Black mortality downwards towards zero. So that the triple in magnitude difference is probably actually an underestimate of the real difference given those expectations. Second is this is such a good point, and something I've kind of struggled with. Maybe that's why I've been working on this paper for so long, which is I don't think that air conditioning is, especially inefficient air conditioning, is like a policy implication of this paper. More my interest is understanding like it is an imperfect, probably like the least perfect adaptation we've developed, given its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, but nevertheless testing its moderating effect in the same way that we could also test like whether where you build a seawall, if that had a beneficial effect on mental health after sunny day flooding in some place, or all these adaptations that we develop, testing the extent to which they moderate the effects that we care about. So health for me, I think nevertheless deserves attention, even if at the back end, we don't actually think that giving folks AC, especially inefficient AC, is a good solution for the climate crisis. And so I think that framing probably should bring in a little bit more explicitly that the aim is to test the moderating role, not to use that then to come up with some recommendation for doing AC. So yes, certainly the best policy solution is efficient AC as well as like collective efforts for cooling. So more infrastructure for cooling centers for particularly vulnerable folks, policies for people in long-term care facilities or nursing homes, where we might get more bang for our buck for like an economics perspective in installing AC for the most vulnerable, ensuring that the policies allow for those folks to access cooling centers if they don't have it in their center. So those are like important, I think, takeaways from this. But really, really smart questions. Thank you, Janan. Ganan.
Thanks
Thank you
so
very
much.
much.
I've got a question from Sean.
I didn't know
Hi,
that I was
Sean.
next. Hi, how's it going? Sean here at Stony Brook. Um, One question I had, I suppose, was, or one way that you're thinking about this is AC is kind of like an individual, or it feels like an individual thing. And I kind of wanted to push you to think about or ask you whether or not is probably the better phrasing here. There are sort of impacts of the way that we sell electricity. You talked a bit about electricity, but often when in these like high heavy use areas, there can be rolling blackouts because
Yeah.
people are dragging the electricity, and of course, when you do that, richer households often have generators that then kick in. So you might, and whole neighborhoods might have such things, whereas other neighborhoods might be left behind. So I was kind of wondering to what extent you thought that some of that might be integrated into this. It seems like a potential policy point. So thanks. It was a great presentation.
Thank you, Sean. Yes, blackouts are increasingly, especially with contemporary episodes of heat, super important. So, like Texas, even in spells of extreme cold, Texas a few years ago had that horrible episode of extreme cold that led to quite a few deaths during a period of blackouts. That is something that I have considered empirically and have searched the energy is us EIA, lots of data sources where I was trying to get information at some geographic scale, preferably county, month, on where blackouts occurred. That's one of the difficulties of using this historical context. Those records, to the best of my knowledge, have not been kept. In a newer project that's in the very early stages, my collaborator and I are gathering those data. Because they are kept now for certain states on where blackouts occurred and for how long. And so for me, I think that is kind of like an unobserved potential factor in those kind of three-way interactions that like the most vulnerable places um, that those processes are probably operating and driving some of those observed differences in the attenuating role of AC. But again, it's something that's like difficult to observe in the 1970s. You asked about, I don't know if you guys can still see my slides, but you also kind of mentioned like how people purchase AC. I'll note that like during this time in the late 60s and 70s, lots of room air conditioner units were sold in Sears catalogs. And so this is just like an ad from Fort Hood, Texas, showing you the price of air conditioning in 1975 for these new Whirlpool air conditioners. So it's still quite expensive. $220 in 1975 is almost $1,000 in contemporary dollars. And lots of them were sold in Sears catalogs as well. So it's definitely like the paper is trying to suggest that it's not just about access, because I think that's what we might originally think, but it's also about the contexts in which that access, and I hate to use a term like returns. It's very like economicsy, and also it's not because it's not like a causal claim around exogenous source of AC. It's hard to like kind of make that. Um, but that this idea that the returns to AC, it's not just about having AC, but it's also the context, electricity prices matter, blackouts, when you can actually use it matter. And so this three-way interaction with these three variables of poverty or low income, housing or older housing stock, and electricity prices are my best way at getting that given the data limitations.
Wonderful. So, seeing if we have any other raised hands. Let's see, 5 minutes left. I guess I had one quick question I could pitch you. Oh, Min-Heng, let me let them go first.
Hi,
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the slide. And Ethan, hi, good to see you here.
Nice to see you. I didn't know you were coming.
Yeah, I'm coming. Yeah, and thank you for your very wonderful presentation and really decent research. I think I just have a quick question about the extraordinarity of adopting AC. Since you're also talking about the historical context of the expanding AC adoption. As we all know, like the 1960s seems to be the peak of the civil rights movement, and I was wondering, like, if the civil rights movement has also other like Fair Housing Act, something like this, something like these outcomes of civil rights movement would impact the accessibility to AC adoption, maybe possible extraordinarity of adopting AC. Do you think?
So it's an interesting idea of trying to use something observable at the county year or county year month level to instrument for like who could have purchased AC. I'd have to think through that a little bit. So I'm not exactly sure. So instead of directly answering your question, I'm going to kind of wrap around and tell you what I think broadly about racism during this time. This is a time, like in particular, where desegregation or like there was stark segregation and efforts at desegregation that largely failed, and like access to pools. So like public pools, particularly in the South, were segregated during this time. And so that might be, those are like often places that people go to cool down. And so access to those may have mattered. Other factors that were happening at this time, the 1970 Clean Air Act occurred, which reduced pollution exposure over this time period. That likely also mattered, although the existing evidence on the Clean Air Act and reductions in pollution for mortality are not super convincing, especially racial disparities in mortality. So there are lots of other things that were happening during this time, as with any temporal context that we're studying. So as far as using that for AC, I'd have to think a little bit more. It wouldn't matter for the estimates of heat on mortality, but there might be some there for thinking about the distribution of like new housing markets that we're trying to desegregate. Maybe.
Thank you.
Come to my office hours and let's talk.
Okay.
Thanks. So I'm not seeing any other hands up. We've got 2 minutes. I will just ask a quick question about, Emily?
Yeah, I see one in the chat. Ogo has a question.
Okay, sorry. Let me.
Ogo, do you want to say it out?
Thank you, Emily.
Or say it out loud, or do you want me to read it?
Let me just thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I love the visualizations and all that. We're out of time. I'm just wondering, these are about things happening indoors, the ACs, What about outdoor activities? Because life is not only constrained indoors. In fact, it's being advised people increase their outdoor activities like physical activities. So are there ways we can kind of form policies to support climate change, like outdoor activities in the era of climate change? Thank you.
Another fantastic question. You guys are really nailing it. Okay, so I'm gonna answer this question in terms of like the empirical analysis. So, given my substantive interest in the moderating role of residential air conditioning, I use those daily minimum temperatures as the estimates of heat because on average, the like lowest that any given day will be in temperature occurs just before dawn. And so that's when most likely, not everyone, of course, but most likely people are able to actually use the air conditioning is when they're at home. Also during this time, so in addition to all those other macro level processes that I was talking about, this also was a time of pretty rapid expansion of entry, especially among women, into the labor market. So the 1960s, increasingly women were re-entering the labor market. And this was also a time when like more public places, so like cinemas, grocery stores, had installed air conditioning during the 1950s. So the idea for using the nighttime temperature is that like I'm particularly interested in when it might be most consequential when people are at home. And also it might more validly construct the propensity for heat effect to affect health because increasingly people, and not everyone, but people working in these contexts, which were increasingly women as well as men, were able to offset the effects of daytime heat if you were living or if you were working in those places that already had installed air conditioning in office buildings or, you know, in the cinema and grocery store. So there's the empirical thing. More broadly, I think you're absolutely right. And I would just suggest that these, again, are just likely as a consequence of that underestimates of the true heat mortality relationship because more marginalized workers who, like farm workers or construction workers, who spend time outdoors, more time outdoors are like at an even greater risk. And so this operationalization may not be picking up the effects of heat, or it may not be doing so to the extent that we might expect. And then finally, I'll just say that like the kind of nighttime temperature, the like just before dawn temperature is particularly consequential because in contexts where there's like high level of heat during the day, but then it cools off at night, that's not as strongly associated with mortality because lots of the biological mechanisms like sleep disruption or being able to cool down and dissipate heat, you're able to do that if it falls below, you know, like 22 or 21 at night when you get home from work. So I think that's a really important point around what exactly the choice that I made empirically is picking up. So yeah, thank you, Oneso.
Thank you, Ogo, and thank you, Ethan, for engaging with all these questions. I think I hadn't anticipated the question on gender and work, but the matter of older adults, which is an increasing share of the population, then also stands with that question. So that's going to be really important as Ogo pointed out to bear in mind. Wonderful. So, folks, jumping in because we are at time, and so we will just share with you. Well, first of all, I'm remiss. Please join me in thanking Ethan for this talk and the engagement with all the questions. I think this is extremely timely and robust scientific understanding of what's going on. On all our minds, even in Montreal, which has as much snow as it has heat, although Miles will tell me it's nothing. But yeah, it does get cooler at night. So I guess there's that. We did say this was the last Lunch and Learn, but it is not our last event of the year. And so coming up, we have the Candy 3 keynote address, which will be wrapping up both our whole program and our year. And so Debbie Carr is going to be coming, Dr. Deborah Carr is going to be coming to talk about older adults' complex family lives in the 21st century. So please join us in person. You are more than welcome to join us on June 9th at the McGill Faculty Club, but also virtually. So please snap this QR code and register to join us. And while you're at it, sign up for our newsletter. We are still going to be, as I said, the program is wrapping up, but we're still going to be pushing out great content and information for a little while after that. So stay with us and keep in touch. So on that, folks, I want to thank you for joining us, folks who took time up of your lunch to come and have some food for thought along with your actual food, and invite you to stay in touch with us. And our speaker will stay with our fellows, with the Candy 3 fellows, for a little bit longer for our Meet the Speaker special event. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.